Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast, coming at you today in Crosby, Mississippi, with Southern Outdoorsman Podcast alum. This is the first time he's been on the video podcast, Mr. Travis Murray. Travis, how are you?
I'm doing great, guys. Glad to be back.
Well, I appreciate you letting us come into your home here, and like we say this to everybody, we've come in and destroyed your house with all of our camera gear. There's cameras and lights all over the place. We got to take a tour, look at all your gigantic deer. Travis is out here skull capping deer significantly larger than what I've ever killed.
Let alone ever seen.
Never seen. Jacob, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's awesome. So I have to give a shout out to our buddy and mutual friend, Brian Landry, because Brian's told us for a while now, he's like, dude, if y'all get a chance to go to Travis's house, you need to get the full tour, and you got to get him back on the podcast. And finally, we able to make it happen. So, Brian, appreciate you. Some also piece of advice for some stuff we're going to film a little bit later on today as well that Brian kind of gave us some tips on. So, super excited to be here, and I'll be honest. Like we're in the I think we call it the pool house, right? Next to your home,
My dog house.
the dog house, and we got some hammers in here. But what's crazy is the main house, which because of some reasons we came to film over here. You've got all your megas, but there's some giant deer. Like we've got one that's sitting here on the floor that people will see here in a little bit, 191-inch deer, I believe. It's just sitting here. It's got to get mounted at some point, but
Yeah, I had cape problems with him. We had a storm come through, and the taxidermist lost the cape to that deer, so I've got to get another cape. And the deer I killed last year, he was so disfigured from the other buck. I got a lot of deer I got to get capes for. I had a bunch of older mounts that have just deteriorated through the years, so I got to have a lot of deer remounted.
by the way, that is one of my, other than losing a freezer of deer meat, that's one of my worst nightmares, is getting some kind of parasite, some kind of like moth, whatever bug in the house, and then destroying capes and having to get deer remounted. Because not only is it a lot of money just to get them remounted, but also it's nice when you have the original cape on that deer. But it's also one of those circumstances, like if it happens, it happens, and it's unfortunate. But you had that happen with quite a few deer, because you've got some skull mounts around here, some skull caps that you're talking about, like you got to get them remounted. But Travis, I'm really excited to get you back on the podcast, because we were listening to one of your original episodes you did with us, which was back in, I think 2020 was the first 2 times we've had you on. I think you've been on 4 times. This is the 5th time having you on. But there's so much here for us to talk about that I've been interested in picking your brain on. Specifically, there's a lot of the audience members that don't know about you because maybe they haven't been listening that long. The show's tremendously grown since the last time you've been on here. Some have maybe gone back and re-listened to some of your early episodes, but you're a traditional bow hunter. And one thing I really want to start off on is specifically, should we do the failure? Should we talk some failures?
I don't know. It sounded like you were leading it strong.
I was leading it.
Now you're second guessing yourself.
Then I got distracted because there's a lot here. But let me ask this, Travis, can you give us a rundown as a kid, who were influences for you when it came to deer hunting? What was that like as a kid growing up in this area of the country, getting into deer hunting?
Well, I was immediately at a very young age, and that's been a long time ago now, so my dates may be a little off, but as a young child, I was fascinated with bows and arrows. If it launched an arrow, it just mesmerized me. And back then, in the 70s and early 80s in southwest Mississippi, it was 30-06 Remington Woodmasters, running dogs, deer drives. Bow hunting was not really cool at that point. And as a child in the family hunting club down here across the river, all my uncles and the older men, they were great people, wonderful men. And you know how friends pick at each other. I took a lot of ribbing, and it was all kind, but it was still there, hunts with sticks and, the other things, because there were a few bow hunters, but there weren't many. And I was running around out there when I got up to be 8, 10, 12 with my little bear cub. I don't know, I think it's in here somewhere. And one of the first formative things that happened to me was a soybean field that we had on our property at that time, and it was early season, and I kept seeing these bucks come in the soybean field. And I had killed one deer. I think I had killed one deer with a 308 Woodsmaster on a deer drive. And I kept noticing these deer coming in, and somehow I managed to get close enough. I saw this velvet 7-point, which was just a monster to me at the time. He might as well have been the Hansen book as far as I was concerned. And he was out in that bean field at, I don't know, way too far for a bear cub longbow or recurve. And I was just sitting there, and I knew he wasn't going to feed by me. It was probably, I don't know, 3, 4 in the afternoon, fairly early. He was out in them beans. Beans were up pretty high, and I just decided to go for it. And I slipped down, and I got on my hands and knees, and I started crawling in them beans. And I just watched where he went, and I crawled to a point that I thought I might intercept him, and I'd peep up over the beans. And back then, I thought deer were super, just at a mile, if you twitched an ear, you're busted. I had deer up on a pedestal, their senses that was, luckily they're not quite that good. And I'd peep an eye up every now and then. And anyway, I wound up just fate. That poor deer managed to wind up close enough that I got an arrow in him and killed him and found him. And that changed me forever, I think, because it was, to this day, that's probably my best hunt ever. But I still had no respect at the camp. And we were at an outdoor show in Alabama, and my parents were there. I don't know if I was 10, 11, 12, maybe 13. I honestly forget exactly how old I was, but Fred Bear was there, and he was taking some kids out and just shooting with us. And I talked to him briefly. Real nice guy. This is before hunting became so, you didn't have all the hunting shows. You didn't have everything you have now. And my parents didn't even really know who Fred Bear was. They knew he made some bows, but it wasn't the celebrity culture. And he took me and several other kids out and just informal shooting lessons. And, I told him how the older guys made fun of me and all of this. And, he told me, he said, if you just stick with it, you'll wind up the best woodsman of the group. And he gave me the incentive, and he kept the fire going, because I never put them down, but I tried compounds. I love compound bows. I love crossbows. If it flings an arrow, I love it. I just love the traditional bows the most. And I went through my compound phase, and then I went through the rifle phase, because as a young man, I wanted to kill deer. I was really mad at them for a while. And then I started killing deer, and then I wanted to kill big deer. And I was just like solving the problem in the bean field. My mind was always trying to figure out another piece of the puzzle to get better bucks, because I had gotten quite adept at killing deer with a rifle. And I would use climbing equipment. I worked for EPA, the power company, and I'd climb up in the top of a pine tree with them hooks and spurs and that rope, and I'd look down in clear cuts with my 25-06, and I killed some nice bucks that way. And I remember saving up. I worked all summer. I bought a pair of Swarovski binoculars, which was about like buying a house would be now back then. And so I just progressed, and the compound years, I loved them. They were wonderful. I just reached a point that I decided I was going to go back to my true love, the traditional bows. And I'm unusual in the traditional world that I shoot recurves. I shoot hybrid longbows, and I shoot longbows. There's a lot of guys I know in the traditional world, and they just can't shoot different bows. I shoot them all equally poorly. I'm a rather terrible bow shot on paper, to a point. My friend, everyone knows him, Byron Ferguson. He gave me a piece of advice many years ago because I like little groups, and I'd shoot my arrow, and then he's the one that told me to only shoot one arrow at a time. And that was very sage advice because apparently he had the same issue I had, that shooting multiple arrows at a time caused issues. And I won't go too deep into that, but that was some sage advice from Byron Ferguson. And that's basically how I evolved into where I am now, which it's all about the enjoyment of the hunt. If I happen to get up on a good buck, that's fine. If not, I'm not too upset about it. I'm all in it for the joy. I don't put out cameras anymore. I don't target mature bucks like I used to. I did that. I was running cameras, and that was back. I was shooting compounds. My last compound was a Bowtech Destroyer. Great bow. But I just kind of burned myself out on that. I had a bunch of cameras in different places. I'm unusual in that, being in real estate, I'm an appraiser, and we have a brokerage company. I have a lot of places I can hunt. I'll talk to people, and you can hunt here. I've got a lot of places I can hunt, some very good places. And so I would put cameras out, and I called it trolling for bucks. And I'd put the cameras out, and where you would think there would be a great buck, there wouldn't be. And then where you didn't think there was one, there's a hammer on film. When I got a picture of him, I turned into an obsessed. I devoted my life to killing that deer. Sometimes I did, a lot of times I didn't. But cameras are responsible. I was talking to a fellow about this the other day, and he asked me how many big deer would I have killed without the cameras? And I would have killed some. But the fact is, the cameras are what put a lot of these big deer on my wall. And I just, I decided that I got to the point that I'd see a picture of the deer, and I know that buck, or I know that doe, and I decided, just for me, I'm nothing against cameras, I'm not an anti-technology guy in any way. I just decided, for me, just put it all aside, grab my bow, go in the woods, and I started focusing a lot more on public land too. I've always hunted public land. It feels good to kill a legal deer on public land to me. It gives you that feeling of accomplishment and satisfaction. And I've been accused of being a little bit crazy because I have access to some of the finest private land in Mississippi. And I mostly hunt forest. I mean, where the biggest deer are in this part of the world right now, I don't usually go hunt there much. And just a decision. I would, at this point in life, I would honestly rather one of my grandkids or a friend or someone else kill the big buck. I'm not the big buck killer I used to be, because I don't have that's not a priority anymore. Now, I did kill a pretty good buck last year. He had been severely beaten up by another buck, and he would have died. It was really a mercy killing, and he was not at himself. I'm glad I was there and that I could save him from being pulled down by the coyotes. But that other buck had completely gouged out an eye, and he was gored all in the stomach and in the hindquarters. I mean, he was gonna die. And when I put the arrow in him, he really didn't. He just kind of lurched up and walked off. He was a very sick, unhealthy deer. And that's kind of how I've turned into what I've turned into, and which I help more people hunt now. When I have a real estate client, they'll buy a piece of land, and I'll set up a food plot for them, or they'll get my advice on something, and they kill a nice buck. I'm not going to lie to you, I get all fired up because I like seeing other people have success too.
I want to go back to your earlier upbringing. You mentioned that you grew up dog hunting and you grew up around guys who maybe didn't respect the bow hunting so much. And obviously you ended up growing up into this guy who shoots gigantic deer like the one on the floor right here. And I'm just curious, was there anybody in your upbringing who was like that, who was the big buck hunter who wanted to go out and hunt trophy whitetails?
No, no. The best woodsman, my Uncle Red, who was my grandfather's brother, he had that influence on me of not killing the big bucks, but I noticed that he was a woodsman. He's the one that ran the dogs. And I remember right up here in this national forest, right behind where we're sitting now, when I was 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I don't know. I was young. And they were running dogs, and Uncle Red always followed the dogs through the woods, so to speak. And he's usually the one that killed the most deer. And I remember seeing him appear in that bottom, and he just drifted through that bottom like a puff of smoke. You could see the way he was a woodsman. And he usually killed the biggest deer. He killed the most deer because he had the best woodsmanship. Now, my grandfather was very supportive. He didn't ridicule me much about the bow. He supported me. He didn't, he was very nice. And the only thing he told me was when he got me my first little bow, little toy bow, I remember he looked me in the eye and he said, "Now, boy, I better not find no arrows in no roof barns." He gave me the speech. But he was very supportive, but he was not the woodsman that my Uncle Red was. Uncle Red was a woodsman, and he didn't target trophy deer. Back at that point, if you were a trophy hunter and you were waiting on a 150-inch deer, you were going to be in for a very rough situation because there weren't that many. When the soybeans hit and they were everywhere, you started seeing some nice bucks. But there really weren't many trophy hunters back then.
What was different about him that made him, was he just more into it? What made him a woodsman that maybe some other folks hadn't caught on to?
I think he had a trait that I have. I think that's one of the reasons that some people view me as a good woodsman. He loved being in the woods. He spent a lot of time in the woods. He moved easily through the woods. And he had an inquisitive, he wanted to be a good woodsman. I remember there's a lot of guys that hunted back then. I can remember some of my other uncles and some of the older guys, they were always in a hurry and they wanted to get out there, and if they didn't see a deer, they were upset. Uncle Red was easy going, went with the flow, and he stayed in the woods a lot. I mean, the number one way to become a good woodsman is spend a lot of time in the woods.
How would you describe the term woodsman?
Someone that has spent enough time in the woods that they can move around in the woods and ease through the woods without upsetting a lot of wildlife. If you can ease through the woods, and I call it staying at peace with the wrens, and if you can stay at peace with the wrens, you're going to see a lot of squirrels, you're going to see a lot of deer. The other aspect of it would be reading sign, understand the movements and habits of what you're hunting, just a general knowledge of the woods and the ability to interact in them without scaring everything out of 6 counties. Staying at peace with the wrens is not easy because they are tenacious little birds, and it could be thrashers. If you're moving through the woods, and not many people are still hunters like I am. There's not many people that are moving trying to hunt. Most people are stand hunters now, and that's it's a totally different sport. But a still hunter, if you were regularly upsetting the wrens and songbirds and got squirrels barking at you, you're doing something wrong. You're moving too fast. You're sounding like a human. The smaller animals will tell you if you're doing well or not.
in that regard, the term woodsman is something we try to bring up quite a bit because, and Andrew brings the story up quite often with different podcast guests, that his mentor, Ben George, always would say, the highest, well, actually, what's the actual
The
quote?
best compliment an outdoorsman can receive is to be called a woodsman.
And I feel like that's a big aspect of what we try to highlight in the show, because that's something me and Andrew are trying to learn to become better and get guys on like yourself who we would classify as a woodsman that could explain it and work through their level of focus, but also attention to detail when they're in the field. And I think that's a lot of the aspect of being a good woodsman, and also just being a successful hunter as well, and understanding how to handle different situations, learn from mistakes, learn from failures, in order to have more success in the long run, instead of trying to take the shortcut in order to try to have success by whatever means that could be, but truly trying to learn from those mistakes and make the most out of it. And that's something I really wanted to talk to you about. Is on previous episodes with you, you've brought up a lot about the term of, or the phrase of failure, and you have a certain quote there about in regards to failure is the
seasoning that makes success taste so good.
There you go. Yeah, which is something super interesting, and I think there's really good lessons to be learned from guys who spend, like yourself, that spend a lot of time in the field, who have opportunities. And you've mentioned before in the past, but you have a very low success rate. Okay. But it's the time you put into it and learning from those mistakes is what allows you to finally, be able, kill the deer that you're looking for. What is your advice or your thoughts on overcoming failure and learning from failure?
Well, let me clarify something there. My success rate with a longbow on truly mature large bucks, and I'm going to take the large out of the picture, mature bucks, because a deer is just as hard to kill whether he's got a little 120 on his head or he's sporting 200 inches. Maturity. My success rate on mature bucks with any gear is pretty low. When I just go hunting, my success rate is really like in the next cold front comes through. I'm not hunting right now. It's open in Mississippi. I'm past the point in life that I'm going to fight a tick for a deer. It's 90 degrees out there right now. I don't want to hunt in this. Next week, there'll be a front coming through. It's going to drop down into the 50s at night, be in the 70s and low 80s in the daytime. God willing, I will probably take, it's in the other house. I'll probably take my Big Jim Thunderchild. And if I go hunting 3 to 5 times, I'll probably get something. Be a doe. If I'm lucky, maybe it's a buck. I don't know. But my success rate just hunting is actually not too bad at all. Hunting and hunting mature deer are two totally different things. Number one, mature deer are extremely rare. There's just not that many of them. And they have a set of instincts, and the way they conduct themselves, the way you hunt other deer usually won't get you on them. They're a different ball game. So I just wanted to clarify that about the success rate. It is very low when I'm hunting. What I was talking about with that statement, when I'd get a picture of a big buck and I decided that I was going to go after him, I got a lot of those bucks, but sometimes I'd hunt all year and a lot of them I didn't get. So that's what I was talking about, the success rate. I just wanted to clarify that.
And I think that's accurate with everybody. I mean, when you're trying to have consistency success of mature deer, just different things can happen. I mean, one of our good friends, Michael Perry, who's killed some really big deer in Alabama on public land, he's like, if I get 1 to 2, maybe 3 opportunities a season, that's a good year. I've got to execute on every opportunity I have at that mature buck. Because again, he hunts a whole bunch, and it goes back to the time in the field. Not every time you're going out there, not every 10 times. Once every 10 times you go out, you're going to even see a mature buck, let alone have an opportunity. So you're trying to have to execute on those opportunities. Now, going back to this term, I don't even like necessarily saying failure, but the lack of success and not executing opportunities. I've done that on multiple really large deer. All the biggest deer I've ever seen, I've never killed up to this point. So, there's always certain things that's happened that's caused a missed opportunity on my part. And I think everybody listening and watching this has those same experiences. What is your understanding and take on learning from those experiences to try to keep that one thing from causing you a missed opportunity in the future? Do you have any examples or any thoughts on working through those, as some people may say, failures in order to figure out how to have more success when those opportunities present themselves?
Absolutely. I did say that failure is a seasoning that makes success taste so sweet. Failure is the master teacher. I have learned more from failure than anything else. And the secret of failure, now don't get me wrong. If you're out there and you blow an opportunity at a good buck, it's going to hurt. It's supposed to hurt. Needs to hurt. Embrace that pain and then dissect that experience and figure out, what could I have done differently that might have led to a different outcome. I'll stay awake. Some of my failures, which are many, and some of them spectacular in nature, I'll lay in bed. Sometimes I've had things happen 10 years ago, and I'll be laying in bed at night thinking about it. What could I have done? And some of the greatest lessons I've learned, I'll give you a quick one. And I don't know if I told this story before on the other podcast. Early in my career, there was a stand, and I had killed a lot of does and other bucks out of it. It's in a beautiful bottom, and in the bottom there's a drainage. Doesn't have water all the time, but it's deep. It's like 8 feet. And the deer go down in it, and they cross, and when they pop back up, they're at 15 yards, just doesn't get a better chip shot. Well, this particular morning, the biggest deer that I had ever had an opportunity at, and probably a 150-ish class deer, really nice buck, he comes down the ridge, and I'm going to be, when he's on the other side of that drainage, he's 25 yards maybe, and he stayed over there a while, and I could have took multiple shots at him. And that was, with that compound I had then, that was certainly not difficult. Well, I was going to be smart and let him cross and pop. I was going to go for the sure thing. And unlike every other deer, he went down in there, and I never saw him again. He walked the creek, or walked the drainage. So what lesson did Travis Murray learn from that? When you're hunting mature deer, you take the very first reasonably good shot you have at an animal. And that is a lesson that I have not forgotten, because that one still hurt. That one, just the thought of that memory stings now, because that was a fine buck. So there's an example of failure. Now, am I glad that happened? Absolutely. Because you can bet that the first opportunity I get on a mature buck, now I'm not saying take unethical shots. I think you understand the difference I'm saying there. The first reasonably good shot you have at that animal, take it. And on a similar tangent, set up your equipment so that you can take as varied amount of a shot as you can. What I mean by that is you may not get but 1 or 2 opportunities. My arrows are, I've been accused of, quote, flinging rebar at them, because my arrows are heavy. And they're probably loafing around at all of 150 to 160 feet per second. But they're going to be a 2-blade, cut-on contact, and if he comes out there and he's reasonable and he gives me, and this may be controversial, but it's the truth, it is the way it is. If he gives me a quartering forward shot, and I don't think he's going to turn, I can take that quartering forward. I've killed a lot of big deer with a shot that the experts would tell you wait till he turns more. That's the reason I shoot those heavy arrows, is for forgiveness, because sometimes they just don't give you the great shot. Sometimes you don't get a perfect, everybody wants that deer right there, angle slightly away. If you have to wait on every perfect shot, you're going to miss a lot of opportunities. Once again, I'm not saying take unethical shots. I'm saying try to set your equipment up in such a manner that your range of possible shots are as good. I've never lost a deer I've shot quartering toward me. I have no fear of that shot. Would I rather him turn and give me a slight quartering away? Absolutely. But I don't have to have that.
Yeah, and you brought up Michael Perry a minute ago. He said the exact same thing in Alabama. And man, as soon as you said that, it just brought like a horror story back in my head about a deer. Nothing like that deer, but where his main beams like almost touch each other. He had a rack like that, and he was just by far the biggest deer I had an opportunity at. And I did the same thing. I was trying to wait till he walked in the open, and it didn't work out. So yeah, that was kind of a hard lesson to learn. And what you mentioned it earlier, you like to still hunt, and you kind of breezed over it a little bit. But just for people who are unfamiliar, you are mostly a ground hunter. You use ghillie suits a lot. You use traditional archery equipment. Can you just briefly explain kind of your style and how a typical day of hunting goes for you?
Well, how it goes now as I get older, I'm going to go back to a typical day of hunting back when I was a few years ago. Is I would get up in the morning, generally eat a good breakfast, not before daylight, and I would choose a bedding area that I knew. It would be, there's the places I hunt, I know the bedding areas. And now this is if I was trying to get a good shot at, maybe a decent buck. Is I would go out, and if I was using the ghillie suit, the main thing is to make sure that you have a good fix on the wind. Because hunting bedding areas is very tricky. And my game plan was to get out there, be as scent free as possible. I would smoke up. I've had some confusion from people. I had one guy he was a friend of mine a few years ago, and I told him about smoking up. And he went and got a bunch of plastic and stuff out of his garbage and set fire to it and smoked up in that. Don't do that. I'm talking about leaves and natural material. He wasn't a real bright fella. I love him. I love him to death, but it is what it is. But don't smoke up in your kitchen garbage. Pro tip number 1. And then I wanted to spend some time at the edge of that bedding area, watching that bedding area, because I'm probably going to be in the middle of the day. And then I'll spend my day around the bedding area. I may drift over to another one. And if I haven't gotten an opportunity, usually I'll try to find somewhere right before dark, hour or so, to just sit and watch. Kind of take a stand, so to speak. Maybe under a tree, maybe on a trail. That was my general game plan. Now, it usually got changed by circumstances. And that's kind of what you have to do is let circumstances. I'm a big proponent, and I've done this several times. I've seen a buck leave his bedding area. He'll leave it. There he went. I see him out there too. I catch a glimpse of him 200 yards through big timber, say. Well, I'll try to, where is that buck going? Sometimes I know, sometimes I don't know. If it's in the rut, it's real tricky. The rut is actually, can make things more difficult in some ways. But if I see him coming out there and I know that he's going to wind up at a food plot over here a few hundred yards away or a bean field, man, I'll break and truck it and make a big circle and try to get in front of where I think he's going to show up. And I've killed a lot of deer like that. Just if you know the terrain enough and you know your area, which isn't going to always be the case, and you see that deer, you can often get in front of him. Now, I don't mean run toward him and try to run up on him. You got to cut him off. And you ironically, you can't do that with a hog. I can't do it with a hog. I have tried that with hogs, and you cannot get in front of that hog. I can't. Maybe somebody else can. I've tried it multiple times, kind of getting off on a tangent there, but I love shooting hogs too, especially with traditional bows. And that pig is actually, in many ways, tougher to hunt than a deer. But you can't get in front of him. You can get in front of a buck, because he's probably not. Now, if he's in the rut, all bets are off. He's allowed to be trotting toward a hot doe. But if you think he's going to a food source or something, you can get around him and you can cut him off. But I don't have a static plan that I stick to. I generally have an area. When we ride around the four-wheeler a little bit later, I'll show you some bedding areas that have been bedding areas my whole life. Sometimes the terrain changes. If I'm going after meat, if I'm after a doe, what I'll be doing next week is I will be spending my time down on the river in transition zones. And I will try to spot a deer and then get in front of it, be it a doe or whatever. So it just depends on what I'm doing. I don't have a static. I kind of go with a general plan, and I get in the woods, and then I'm very aggressive at changing my plans. A lot of big deer have been saved by people that won't think outside the box or stick to the plan.
Yeah, I was curious about your thought process behind how you move, because when you say that you're going and you're creeping up to the edge of a bedding area, and then maybe you're kind of working around that one, and then you drift off to another one, which I can hear like the similarity in the language of between you and your Uncle Red, like kind of drifting through the woods like a puff of smoke, just being stealthy. What is it when you get to the edge of a bedding area? What is it that you're looking for exactly? Because I'm always curious of, if I'm creeping along the edge of a bedding area and I find a scrape in a big trail, why not just sit there for the rest of the day? Why keep moving? Or unless that's just what you like to do.
Well, most of the bedding areas in this part of the world are going to have multiple big trails coming out of all sides of them. So that's certainly not the worst thing you can do, is sit on a major trail by a bedding area, especially if you can get to it without alerting everything. Now, some terrain allows movement. I don't care how good a woodsman you are. This is Southwest Mississippi. You're not going to go right out here. National Forest is just a few hundred yards that way. You're not going to move through them woods and not make some noise. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you put on moccasins. I don't care what you do. You can be barefooted. You're going to make some noise. The secret is to make noise, but don't sound like a human. One of the biggest things you can do if you're slipping through the woods, and I do this working my way to my stand, because it doesn't do any good to get to your stand if you're hunting a food plot with a rifle and the deer are coming from a few hundred yards and you're 200 yards from them. Entry and exit is much easier than if you're trying to tuck in with a bow and get right next to his bedding area and catch him coming out of his bedding area. Very different scenario. Under the second scenario, you've got to get in position on the edge of that bedding area without letting everything know you're there. Then you got to have the wind not blowing in the bedding area. There's a lot of things got to come together. So one of the best pieces of advice I can give, we're all going to break sticks. We're going to do something to make a little noise. When you break something, when you make that noise, stop. Just stop right there. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal till you keep going and break a stick few seconds later, break a stick. Animals don't do that. Armadillos do. But you watch a deer moving through the woods, if he breaks something, and you can hear a deer. You'll hear one of the best ways to ID a deer in the woods instead of a squirrel or something is you'll hear a twig break. Then nothing. 5 minutes later, you hear another twig break. It's making a cadence of sound that's the problem. If you break a stick, sit there a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, look around, glass. Don't regularly make loud noise. Now, metallic, anything in your gear that you can get rid of metallic sounds, I just find metallic, and I have a lot of experience with this in ghillie suits. I've had deer at 30 yards. I'm in a ghillie suit, and I can get away with murder in that ghillie suit. And I will do something that, I remember one time I had a quiver, and I had put well, it's right here somewhere. It's that quiver there. And I had a thing on the side of it that I used to like to start fires with, a little metallic thing. It was a type of lighter is what it was. And I moved, and somehow it come around and hit I think I got a bear, and it wasn't even other metal, but it made a tink. And immediately, everybody's looking at me. Metallic is not natural, and it's going to get their attention. So you're going to make noise. You've just got to make the right kind of noise. Make as little as possible. The biggest thing is when you do mess up and break a twig or something, stop for a while.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about kind of smaller things like that. You know, if you break a twig, stay for a while. All these other like very fundamental things. Would you say that might be part of the difference of people who are able to be consistent on, trophy mature whitetail deer and people who maybe aren't? Because you see a lot of people who get really, really into the weeds with tactics. Like we're going to talk about wind directions and buck bedding and this and that, but they never take the time to kind of just tie up all those fundamentals.
Well, I'm very careful about absolutes in deer hunting because I know some gentlemen that are very good deer hunters, very good woodsmen, and they don't do it anything like I do it. So there's more. I'm kind of when it comes to mature bucks, I really don't know a better way to kill them than in the bedding area. In this part of the world, with our hunting pressure, you can hunt scrapes. I've killed one deer in my life over a scrape, and that was a kind of an odd circumstance. But if you sit on food plots in this part of the world during the rut, occasionally you might have some nice bucks come out right at dark chasing a doe, or maybe before dark. It happens, but it don't happen a lot. If you're going to regularly kill deer in the 5-6-year-old age group, I don't know any better way to do it than the bedding area. Now the trouble with that is there's so many ways you can go wrong with that. And if you take me to where y'all live in Alabama, put a bow in my hand, I'm not going to go find a bedding area and kill a 6-year-old buck right off the bat. I'm going to have to learn that area. So if you're somebody that you're working, you have 2 weeks to hunt, maybe you have a week to hunt, and you're going somewhere you don't know the land intently, hunting bedding areas could well be a very frustrating experience. You need time. You need to know the area. If I only had a few days to hunt, I don't think that's how I would choose to spend it. I think I would probably try to find feed tree. I would try another technique other than the bedding area approach that I use, because I know a lot of people that have tried it, and it's a pretty tough game if you get something wrong.
Is there any commonalities in the different habitat types you've hunted down here in Southwest Mississippi that seems to be semi-consistent for mature buck bedding?
If I can find switch cane on the side of a ridge in a scenario where the thermals are bringing the scent to him properly, bucks tend to love switch cane in our area. I've had a lot of, I love switch cane. Now, sometimes it grows in places it's not conducive to bedding behavior. Very often a mature buck likes some sort of slope to be on if he has it. Now, if you get down around the Mississippi River in the deltas where it's just, an anthill is the biggest ground, then you have a totally different scenario. And, like down on the Mississippi River, you have the big Cuckleburr flats. And that is one of my kryptonites. I have tried hunting that, and I've killed one very nice deer in what I call the Cuckleburr thickets. But you got 200 acres of Cuckleburrs. Where's the bedding area in that? For the way I hunt, it's difficult. So the terrain varies greatly, and you have to figure out how you can't always hunt bedding areas. If there's certain types of terrain that just aren't conducive to it. And the biggest problem is there's a lot of places like the Cuckleburr thickets. How do you determine what the bedding area is? If you've got a 60-acre cutover that's all thick and grown up, how do you determine the exact bedding area? You're just not going to, more than likely. You have to, every piece of land is different, and you have to hunt every piece different. The secret to woodsmanship is being able to figure it out on your land. And I don't think there's a book you can read. I don't think there's anybody you can listen to. I mean, you can get pointers and tips. There is no replacement for time in the woods. I mean, it's just all there is to it. And if you don't love doing it, next week when that front comes in and I grab my bow and I hit them woods, I'm going to be just as excited as I can be. And I want to get a deer. I'm hunting. I want that deer. But I'm going to be happy as a clam either way. And I'm going to hunt. That'll keep you in the woods. The enthusiasm and just loving being in the woods, learning. Now, I'm not saying just walk out there and be giggling and acting a fool. I'm talking about you have to embrace the fact that you're usually not going to get a deer. Everything in this era has become so, man, if I don't get a 150, it's a bad year. It's so goal oriented. The first goal for your hunting should be to put a smile on your face. And if you get too goal oriented and put too much demand on yourself, I think that causes a lot of people, because I see guys, they're like, well, the wind's wrong. I ain't hunting today. A lot of guys stay home in blustery, windy weather. Give me spatter and rain, 40, 50 mile an hour winds, spatter and snow, whatever. I'm out there, buddy. That's some of my favorite stuff. It's a totally different kind of hunting. You can get away with murder. And I love me some. The deer don't, in that weather, the deer doesn't somehow vaporize and go to Mars. He's still there. His behavior's going to change. It may not be a good day to sit watching a food plot. That deer is out there. He can't hear you as well. He can't smell you as well. He can't see you as well. Now, the same is true of him, but it gives you, you're never going to be the woodsman the deer is. It gives you a leg up. And on those bad days like that, I'm going to be in them thickets, and I'm going to be in that. I'll go in the bedding area after him. So you're never going to get the deer if you don't play the game. And the more you play the game, the better you're going to get at it.
Yeah, I feel like at the end of the day, like I told you earlier, we've interviewed, we're in the 600s now. of podcast episodes, and that's a lot of guys that we've talked to about deer hunting. And there's very few things that all of them have in common as far as like the true, big buck killers, the really good hunters. There's not very many things that they have in common, but one thing that they do pretty much all have in common is that tenacity and the drive to go out there no matter what and just stay at it. And that's a follow-up question I wanted to ask you about that is, you just mentioned earlier that, a lot of people don't do it the way that you do it. And a lot of good hunters who don't do it the way that you do it. But of all those good hunters that what are the consistent, characteristics, personality traits between all of them?
Well, one I'm thinking of, he hunts only with a bow, and he's really good at figuring out trails, and he usually kills most of his better deer somewhere between the bed. He's not like me. He doesn't like the bedding area and thinks I'm a nut for going in the bedding areas. We pick at each other. If we're nice to each other, we're mad at each other. But he's very good at figuring out. He ambushes them near food sources, but before they get there. He's not in the food source. He's back off the food source. And he's figured out a way to do that, and he regularly kills nice bucks. And then I know another guy that hunts those big Cucklebur flats, that does that kind of stuff, and he's a bow. I'm kind of keeping this with bow hunters, because let's be honest. Let's be real honest here. Hunting with a bow, and I'm not going to separate compound from traditional. They're close enough. Hunting with a rifle is a very different game. Now, I'm all for it. Certainly not casting shade on it, but it's a different. It's so different that the same things that work with this don't work with the other. If I was going to go rifle hunting again, I wouldn't hunt anything like I do with a bow. So I'm going to stick with bow hunting. This guy, he is very good at taking those big thickets where there's no way to find a bedding area, and he will go in there and he'll manipulate that thicket. He'll go in there and he'll make him a shooting lane, and he'll plant a food plot there, and he'll plant what I call, he actually doesn't plant it, he called a woods plot. He'll just open up a place in a thicket where he can see a little bit. And he's a master at manipulating the terrain in those situations to where he gets a shot. Now, I do some of that. I'll put a hinge cut on them. I'll try to change their movement. I really like that part too. But he doesn't really worry about a bedding area. He just wants to find somewhere that they're comfortable and make him a place to set up. Now, I will say, you ask about a trait in common. Both of these gentlemen, which I'm not going to mention their name because they're kind of private people, they probably wouldn't care, but I'm not going to do it without their permission. Both of these guys, if there's a trait that all three of us share, is we're very concerned about wind, very concerned about scent, and very concerned about entry and exit. Those are three things that I think you will find run through most of what you would call your big buck hunters, your trophy hunters that have been successful. These two in particular they're fanatical about their entry and exit. I know one of them in particular will take a rake and clear the path to his stand. I do things like that. When I'm hunting a stand, I will often do whatever I'm going to do at night. If I'm back when I used to hunt compounds and I did hunt out of trees, I never moved a tree stand during the day. I'd go out there 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, and I'd move my stands around, take a light, I'd try not to be too stinky. I tried to maintain some odor control because that's just not good. But I didn't even try to be quiet. I'd go out there and do what I had to do, and I just liked doing it at night. I didn't like moving stands during the day. Now, that's not for everybody, and don't go out there and hurt yourself. But I found that to be quite effective for moving stands, because part of the problem with compound bow hunters and hunting out of trees, and I've seen it over and over, is guys, they'll have a spot that they want to watch, and they'll show up with their climber, and then they'll beat and bang up the tree, and everything within 1,000 yards knows they're there. I know guys, if the rut, he may come on by you later, but that's just not me. I can't deal with that. If I can't get in there quiet and get out quiet, it just physically makes me ill. I just cannot tolerate it. There's a certain fanaticism to it. And noise, especially metallic noise, moving stands and climbing trees, I'm just very, I try to avoid that at all costs.
One thing that I'm just curious, when we're talking the habitat down here, you talked about switch canes, one of those types of bedding areas that there's a consistency with mature bucks using, and some of this habitat type, kind of this rolling hill country. Would you also say in that area, is cover a limiting factor majority of the time outside the switch cane, or is there a lot of other potential areas a buck could potentially be using?
Absolutely. The switch cane in and of itself is not. The switch cane has to be in the right place. And I have found right here, like I said, you get down on the Mississippi River where there's no ridges. I have found that if you can find a switch cane thicket, you've got a ridge. And you find a ridge where the thermals are bringing the scent over the top, and then he can sit in that switch cane and look out of it down through a bottom or something. We can see in front of him, and then the wind is bringing it to him from the backside. That is a very favored bedding area. It's not the only one. It could be greenbrier. It could be a lot of different things. In flat ground, I find isolating bedding areas in flat ground, if there's a lot of thickets, to be almost impossible here. I've had people say, well, you need to, I had somebody want me to take them and show them what a bedding area looked like. And, I know the ground he hunts. That's not going to work where he hunts. He's got a totally different piece of property. It's almost all clear-cut timber company. And my advice to him was, you need to find you some edges. Edges are the only, when you get a big piece of land, like say you got a 60-acre clear-cut, you got to find something different. You got to find an edge, a creek running through it. You got to revert back to edges at that point. A lot of my property, because I've lived here all my life, I know what a bedding area looks like. I know where it's probably going to be. So there's a lot of confusion about the bedding, and everybody wants a cut and dried answer, and that's just not the reality.
And that is so true, because across the Southeast, especially like right where you're at, you could drive probably 40 miles in any direction, and the cover is going to look a little bit different. I'm sure if we go further east, we're going to have a lot more clear cuts and some of that. And then, north, south, a little bit more agriculture in smaller pockets. And then down the river, because one thing that we see in certain areas that we've hunted in Alabama, a couple other states, is palmettos. And, we're about to be in Louisiana and going to go scout some of that public down there. And palmettos is one of those cover types that's super loud walking through. I don't know if have you experienced many palmettos, and it's frustrating just from, you getting large expanses of palmettos that are tall. There's so much cover there. Just even trying to get a visual into any of that cover or sit on the edge of it, it's something that's almost impenetrable getting in through quietly, and also set up on the edge of it. There's so many different routes they can come out. But we have so many different habitat types in the Southeast that, like you're saying, there's not a consistency from one property to another property of exactly what that bedding could look like. It's typically going to be the thickest cover possible. That's allows those deer to have some kind of advantage there. But again, there's just so many types because where we come from, it's mostly all clear cuts.
And they're, all of us, our primary sense is our eyes. You have to keep in mind that a deer's nose is probably his prime sense. And we can go through the woods and we can try to figure out how thermals work. But we're never going to have the understanding of it that the deer does. And I firmly believe that the way the scent moves through a piece of woods can have a huge effect on where that buck beds. Now the problem is we can only guess at it. It's really something that we can't determine. So we have one of their major choices in where to bed is something that we just simply can't account for very well. It's just something we have to accept.
Something else I've been curious in getting your take on is how do you read buck sign? And I want to go back to maybe even like this 190-inch deer, the rack you get sitting here on the floor, and there's a lot of other big deer around us and back in the house. How has sign ever played a factor for you for any of the bucks that you've killed? Is there anything that is any consistency at all with sign associated with big deer that you find that is maybe where you kill them at or how you backtrack them to certain bedding areas or any factor like that?
Yes, that particular deer is not a good example.
Will you hold him up real quick?
Because I got on this deer. He was running from floodwater.
Hold him. Yeah, there you go.
He was running from floodwater. That's all there is to it. So I didn't know he was in the world. I just knew that where I was sitting, the deer were funneling out of a huge bottom that was flooding from the Mississippi River. And in 3 days, I watched about 175 rack bucks walk by. Most of them were not nice, but some of them were huge. He was actually with another buck, not really with, but close, that was much wider. And, he just didn't get, this deer got very close to me. The other one didn't. So he's really not a good example of reading sign because I didn't read anything. I just knew that the river was coming up and it was pushing the deer up. And I just put myself in a position to watch them march by. It was.
Before I get you to answer the sign, what was that funnel like?
Yeah, I was about to say, I got to know.
That funnel was, you have a oxbow lake here. And then you have a public road back here about a 120-yard stretch of woods between a road, a lake, and another lake. And then it's draining probably 17 to 20,000 acres of cropland that they're coming out of that through this little gap. Some of them are going out other ways, but there's a lot of deer. The river's coming up and it's pushing deer off, I'm guessing 17 to 20,000 acres down there. And when they come that direction, you have a lake here, you have a lake here, and there's a public road right on the edge of this lake, and then there's a little 100-yard block of woods. Pretty good funnel. And they tend to walk the edge of that other lake, the one without the road near it. So it's just a rare situation. If the river's not coming up, that's actually a terrible place to hunt. If you don't have water coming, you probably hunt there for days, and there's some deer filter through there, but it's not like when the river's coming up. That particular deer there was hooking trees. He had a very defined bedding area. And reading the sign for him, I say he was hooking trees. There were some very big trees hooked in that area. I didn't see him doing it, but I'm assuming he probably got in on the action. there was a lot of big buck sign there. You know, when you find a tree like that shredded, probably not a knothead doing it. Now, I have seen some knotheads working on big trees. But, you know, and I had a photo of this deer. Back when trail cameras, they hadn't been out long. And I had a picture of him. And that deer is actually the longest bow shot I've ever made. That deer was right at 50 yards as a compound bow. And I don't normally, actually, you met my son earlier. He was in the ground blind with me. And that deer came out and he had his head behind a huge oak. And he was at 50 yards. And I took the shot and it worked out well. That's actually the longest bow kill I've ever made. And I'll probably have people fussing at me for a 50-yard shot, but I was very comfortable. I didn't even worry about him ducking the arrow. So it was I think the next longest shot after that one would probably be in the high 20s because I'm not a long distance guy. That was that was an unusual circumstance. The wind was blowing. It was loud. I felt very comfortable because it was, you know, the treetops were moving around. We were down in that bottom, and I felt comfortable with that shot. But he was, you know, that was more of a typical, I knew he was there. I went after him. I killed him. The other deer, I was just, you know, I recognized where a lot of deer were coming through and took advantage of the situation, but I was not hunting that deer. I didn't know that deer was in the world.
Now, going back to the sign reading, though, is there, when you're looking at, what I'm trying to get at is you associating potentially any kind of sign with how a buck's using specific bedding areas? Or do you find any kind of commonality around specific bedding areas and typically going to try to find some kind of bigger sign to confirm that there's a mature buck there?
Well, I very often used cameras back in the day when I was really targeting big bucks. I used cameras a lot. The sign of big trees tore up is an indication you may have some mature deer there. It's not necessarily 100%. And you may have a 6-year-old that just doesn't have a good rack. And that's fine with me. You know, I would rather kill a 6-year-old 120 than a 3.5-year-old 150. The age is more important to me than what he's wearing on his head at this point. But part of the problem is deer are, they're individuals. And some of them are homebodies and have a very predictable bedding area unless something changes it. The rut can change it, pressure can change, a lot of things can change it. But they tend to be pretty predictable. And then there's some that just don't really, it's probably just my inability to decipher the information, but it's almost like they don't even have a real bedding area. They just, you can't pattern them in a bedding area. And I've seen that back when I ran cameras. There was one buck in particular that I never killed. And I remember I got the first picture of him. And I wanted that deer really bad because he had a drop tine. Wasn't a big one, just a little bitty drop tine. He's a big old mainframe 8-point with a little drop tine. And when I say a big 8-point, he's probably a 145, 150 8-point with a drop tine. And I wanted that deer. And, you know, I isolated where I thought his bedding area was. I put a camera in there. And I didn't get any pictures of him. So I tried where I thought his other bedding area was. And I got some nighttime pictures of him. When I used cameras, I would move the cameras if I had time. And when I started getting pictures of that deer 10, 11, 12 up in the middle of the day, there's a good chance you're right on top of the bedding area, if not in it. And that's how I would, you know, pare down things. Well, I would get daytime pictures of him, and then he'd disappear. Nothing. And this was before the rut. And him and several other bucks, you could just see that they didn't, they probably had multiple bedding areas, and he covered a pretty wide swath. And some deer, that deer stayed in one little area. He never moved anywhere. And so deer are not a mature buck. Some of them are roamers. Some of them have multiple bedding areas and switch patterns at the drop of a hat. And some of them, you can't hardly run them out of there. They're individuals. And you got to take each one as an individual, because if you start trying to say all big bucks are going to do this or that, you're probably going to get disappointed.
If you look back, especially when you're running trail cameras more, did you have more success, it seemed like, with the more homebody bucks that only used maybe one or two areas, it seemed like, majority of the time?
Much easier to kill.
Okay.
The roamers, most of the deer, I'll be honest with you, if I could isolate his bedding area and he didn't change it, because the fact is, a lot of times I would mess up their bed, especially when I first started, because I would determine a good bedding area, and I wasn't satisfied with where I was getting to. I'd say, if I could just get that much, I could see a little further in it. I was a little too aggressive, and I really messed. It's not as easy to mess a deer up as you think a lot of times, but you repeatedly blow him out of his bedding area with scent, he's probably going to change his pattern. And I made that mistake a lot. It took me a while to learn, and now I try to clarify it. I tended to hunt. I tried to get to where I could watch the edge of the bedding area. That's the key, is because if you've got let's say he's got a bedding area that's an acre, which is not actually a very big bedding area, and you can isolate it down to that, you're not going to go up in the middle of that and not alert him. I don't care how quiet you are. The only thing you can do is determine the bedding area and try to figure out a way to entry and exit and watch the edge of it. If you start regularly going in there, it's game over. So you want a clear-cut answer on all this.
No. I like this because it makes me think, and this is, I guess, one aspect of kind of where you come from, both river bottom hunting, but also a little bit of hill country. It is a diverse type of bedding areas. Because when you say a 1 acre bedding area, I can't imagine us finding a 1 acre bedding area.
Yeah, that would be a huge. That was just an example.
That would be a small one.
Where we come from, just because like where we hunt a lot of times, very large expanses of clear cut. And you'll catch bucks on camera there, and it's like they could pop out this 60, 80 acre clear cut.
100, 200 acre clear cut.
At any point, different drainages.
We need to clarify something here. When I say bedding area, you take the Cuckleburr thickets down on the Mississippi River. There's one in particular I can think of, it's 200 acres. You could call that a bedding area. Deer bedding all in it. Chances are, let's say that you got a 6-year-old buck. That's his bedding area. Chances are he's got somewhere in that thicket that makes it a little different that he spends the majority of his daytime. That's what I call actually, I can't think. When I think of a true bedding area, it can't be very big, or you're not isolating it properly. And a lot of deer have teensy little bedding areas. And when I say teensy, I mean a 1/8 of an acre on the side of a ridge switch cane. That's where he spends a lot of his time. Now, it's usually going to be near a bigger thicket that he can get up and ramble around in. If you've got a teensy little area, say an 1/8 of an acre, and it's near some big greenbrier thickets or cutover or anything else, that may well be his bedding area instead of the big. He may be on a little patch on the edge. He doesn't have an acre that he just roams around in all day. He's going to have one little place, most likely, that's not very big at all. So basically what you have with your clear cut scenario is you have a huge thicket that you can't determine the true bedding area. That's the way I see it.
No, I'd agree. It's like we don't necessarily even use the term bedding area. It's just like that thicket. They're coming in and out of that thicket at different points, and that's where I was trying to get back to like the isolation of like isolating specific bedding areas. That small acreage that buck seems to be using a good portion of the time if you get them on camera is how to be able to move that camera back into there, and if you're trying to get daylight images of them in that spot versus catching them on camera on the edge of it. Because again, we use trail cameras. I know you don't use trail cameras really, but we use trail cameras, and a lot of our listeners use trail cameras. So I'm trying to think of it through that lens of how you can get that information, but still it's in a somewhat of an area that you could actually kill that deer during daylight. That's the challenge that I look at with when we've interviewed some other guys that hunt different bedding areas in different areas is trying to get close enough to the X that last 15 minutes of light, he's on his feet, he's starting to ease his way through there. You're getting an opportunity versus if he's in that Cocklebur thicket, 200-acre Cocklebur thicket, he might be 200 yards out into it, and it has a pocket that he really likes, real diverse right there. Well, if I can only hunt the edge of it, I can't push into that Cocklebur thicket. How to figure out the best opportunity possible to potentially kill a deer in that.
Yeah, and that's extremely challenging. That's the reason that they're so hard to kill, and some bedding areas are almost unhuntable. I mean, I don't like the word unhuntable, but there are some bedding areas that are just going to be very low odds. I mean, that's just all there is to it.
One thing I wanted to ask you, looking back at all the mature bucks you've killed over the years, is there a certain time of the year that you've had the most success killing mature bucks in Mississippi?
Pre-rut or after rut?
That's
when my time. I have the rut messes me when I was after a mature buck and I was hunting. Let's say I got a picture of him. When the rut starts and really kicks off, everything I do is out the window. He may not come back to that bedding area. When the rut's on, my tactics change, and I go after the does. I'm not trying to kill them. I just want to be around the ladies because that's where he wants to be. So I will change my tactics during the rut because a lot of the ways I hunt bedding areas. Now I still hunt a bedding area. Don't get me wrong. But my tactic is to be after the does and be around the does. Because a lot of times before rut, he doesn't really want to be around the ladies. He kind of wants to be by himself. He may have a toady that hangs out with him. A smaller buck. He may have some satellite friends. But as soon as you start seeing those bachelor groups where they don't like each other anymore and they start the rut, I find that to be problematic for actually probably when I do best is when the rut is winding down because he'll chase does, he'll get run down, and from Christmas here in this part of the world, from Christmas through first couple of weeks in January is probably the peak of our rut. But you get up in January, that first week in January and a little after, they're starting to get run down. There's less does available. And you still have a lot of your 3 and 4 year olds, 2-year-olds running crazy. A lot of times your really old guys are starting to fall back into some sort of pattern that you can. Now he's allowed to still get the whiff of a hot doe and run off. Don't get me wrong. But late season and before the rut really kicks in is when I have killed most of my better bucks. The rut is not, I love it because I love the excitement of it. You just never know what's going to happen. One of the most exciting hunts I ever had was down in the swamp here on the Homachita River, and it was during the rut, and I mean it was during the rut. They were crazy for the ladies. And I was sitting under a tree. I had been stalking around that morning, and I wasn't targeting this particular buck. And I seen a doe And she come bopping through this big mature trees. You'd have to see the big cypress trees with a bunch. Just a beautiful place. Beautiful place. Great place to be in the woods, enjoy God's beauty. And she's bouncing through woods. And I can tell by the way she's bouncing and her body language that she's got a buck that's bothering her, but she's just acting. He ain't bothering her too bad. You know, she ain't really trying to get away from him. And she's bouncing along, and I watch her, and she bounces through, and I watch her go under the fence into a big grown-up field. Well, I'm probably 90, 120 yards from that spot, and I look, and I don't see anything behind her yet. I jump up, grab my stuff, and I break and run. I ain't worried about breaking sticks. I ain't worried about nothing. I got to get there quick where she went under that fence. I broke and run. I skidded to a stop and got set up and got under a tree with some branches over me. That's what I like. Had some stuff over me. And I'm 10 yards from where she went under that fence. And I'm looking, and it was a little bit. I was starting to think, well, maybe I was wrong. And I seen him. And here he comes. And he's bouncing at first, and he was bouncing because there was a place where he was kind of in water. And you got it, and you could just see him. He puts that head on the ground like a hound dog. And you know where he's going. There's no doubt where he's going. He's going right where that doe went. And he come on through. I put an arrow, and he was probably 130-inch 10-point. He wasn't a nice deer, but what a beautiful morning in the woods. And, you know, that wouldn't have been possible without the rut. So I love the rut. I have found for the way I hunt, the rut may not be the best scenario to kill the mature buck I happen to be after. Because it makes he becomes like a hog. You don't know what he's going to do. That's what makes killing one particular hog so difficult, is he wakes up every morning and there's just no telling what he's going to do. And the rut makes a buck that way. There's just, the patterning them gets much tougher.
I'm curious, you know, you just mentioned killing that 130-inch deer, and you've killed, I mean, what we've seen at your house today, like, I don't even want to guess how many nice deer you've killed. You've killed probably, what, 30, 40 deer over 130 inches, more than that, you'd say?
Honestly, I've been hunting a long time, and I hunted with a lot of weapons. Back during my years of hunting with a 25-06 out of treetops, I killed a lot of deer, killed a lot of nice deer. That's how I first learned to kill mature bucks. That's what got me on the bedding area game. Yeah, I've killed at least 30 to 40. I've probably killed over 50 deer in the 5 to 6 range. I don't really want to get into the scores because I'm not terrible at it. I'm not terrible at it. I am terrible at it. I'm not a score guy. You know, to me, a big slick 8 is one of the prettiest racks there is. I'm just not a numbers guy. You know, so I don't, how many over what percentage I've killed, I'm not sure. I've probably killed better than 50 bucks in the 5 or 6 year old grade age range. Some of them have giant antlers. Some of them are more normal. But they're just, you know, a 6-year-old that is a 6-point is just as hard to kill as a 6-year-old with 200 inches on his head. The horns don't make them smart, it's the age. So I value age way more than I do. Now, don't get me wrong, everybody likes the big buck. There's nothing wrong with hunting a big buck. But I don't keep up with that, so I honestly don't know how many over what score I've killed.
I'm also curious about this too. We were talking earlier about your progression as a hunter, and where you went from killing the 7-point in the bean field to then moving on to a rifle and killing some nice bucks with a rifle, climbing up in the tops of pine trees. I'm really curious about when you got interested in like really shooting some like trophy deer, and you killed the first, what you would consider like giant whitetail that you killed. What was that hunt, and what was that like for you?
It's difficult because I don't know that he was a giant. He was, but I don't know how well he would score. That deer is not here. It's in the basement of our office, actually. I've got to get it remounted. But he was a deer that I wanted terribly. And he was a big deer with a big body. And it's back when I was financially challenged. And I didn't have the, mounting a deer to me back then was a very much of a financial hardship. But I did it anyway. It was almost a spiritual experience because I really wanted that buck. And when I finally got him, I do remember, and I'm not embellishing this, I remember that I just sat there and I just looked at him laying there. And I was just, honestly, I was just trying to do everything I could to drink up that moment and enjoy. That was a really, really good day. And I took the time to, that's back before cameras. I love photography. And I don't even have a picture of that deer. And I wish I did. Now it's in the brain here. But I just felt extremely thankful, lucky, fortunate. Those are all feelings that went through me. A sense of, I wouldn't say pride. It was thankfulness. It was a very powerfully moving situation. And the most important thing about it is, for me, that has never changed. Next week, if I go out and the good Lord grants me success and I get a nice fat doe, I am going to be thrilled. I'm going to have a great day. I'm going to sit there. I've never killed a deer that I grab it and load it up in the truck. I'm going to sit there. I'm going to thank the Lord for that opportunity, and I'm going to drink in that success. A doe is a huge success. So having that, I've never felt like a professional, don't want to be a professional. I don't know that I like the term big buck killer. I mean, I hunt a lot. I've killed some big bucks. But let's be honest, a lot of the reason I've killed a lot of big bucks is I have access to some really great land. I used to hunt some really great land. A lot of guys, you can't go out there you take 3 counties over from here. It's all pine thickets and pine cones. And you have a very seasoned hunter there that can kill 5 or 6 year old deer. And look at his wall, and he's going to have a bunch of 120s and 130s. Is that really any less impressive than mine? Not to me. He's just as good a hunter. He's killed a mature deer. He didn't live in an area that he had access to kill true giants. And so for me to say that there's something special at the wood, I try to be a good woodsman. I try to target mature deer. I had the opportunity, still have the opportunity to hunt land where mature deer get old and can get very large. But that can't be that's no different than the man hunting in North Florida that kills a 6 year old that scores 110. In my mind, that's just as good a trophy. So to answer your question overall is every deer I've ever killed, especially the bigger ones, it's just been thankfulness. And the one that deer there that my boy was in the blind with me which to be honest, he really didn't care that much. He was more interested in getting back, and he was a little bitty thing. But it meant a lot to Dad. And so killing a deer to me is almost a spiritual thing, and I thank God for that, because if I didn't enjoy it, and if I didn't have that burn, I'm plumb excited next week when that cold front comes through. You just don't know how fired up I'll get over a doe, and thank God for that, because that's what keeps me in the woods. Now don't get me wrong, I would love for a huge 10-point to walk out. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to keep that fire for just being in the woods and enjoying it. And honestly, y'all are right. That is one thing I've noticed in most what we would call successful hunters is that energy and that fire. And while I'm on that subject, let's discuss a successful hunter. I know a guy, I'm not going to mention his name. I'll probably see him in a day or two. And he doesn't hunt anything but public land. I bet the biggest deer he's ever killed is, I bet y'all wouldn't even draw on it. I don't think he's ever killed anything more than probably a 110, just a small rack buck. But every deer season, he is just so excited. He'll kill him a doe. He'll kill him some legal bucks. You know, they're not going to be very big probably. But he is absolutely loves it. Is that not a successful hunter? And then I know hunters that have incredibly nice property. They got 140s, 150s, 160s running around on their property, and they're never happy. They're never happy. They gotta, now this didn't go right. I gotta get this stand over here. They're so focused on results, they don't enjoy the hunting anymore. And, you know, that's my biggest advice to everyone is don't let that happen to you. Enjoy the hunting. That if you're smiling and enjoying yourself, you're a successful hunter.
I would love for you to tell, and I don't know if you have a story like this, you probably do, all the encounters you've had, of a memorable buck that got away. Seen the deer, kind of like you mentioned earlier with the creek, but maybe a deer you try to hunt, you had some history with, but he got away, but it was still a very memorable experience.
I've got a bunch of them. I'm trying to think of them more. Because honestly, a lot of the failures have been where I messed up the bedding area and the buck just disappeared. You know, he just changed his pattern. That's probably my number one failure, is being too aggressive and going in and changing his pattern. Then I just don't see the deer anymore. Of the failures, I had he was an 11 point. And it's early when I had killed some pretty decent deer, but I was still pretty young. And I can get, you remember when we were out there with Hooligan earlier, and I showed you how he goes from being goofy to not goofy? I can have that way. I'm that way when a deer shows up. You know, I'm all business. I turn into Hooligan. That's the center of my universe right there. Well, I got so focused on that deer, and I was watching him, and I let him come down. And there's no other word for it. I was nervous. And that's back when I had a compound. And for whatever reason, I forget, I believe I had taken my arrow off the bow, had it hanging. This was in a tree, and I had the bow hanging there. And I believe because I always keep, like in that quiver right there, there's broadheads, and then there's some blunts for squirrels and such. Because when I'm hunting, I may shoot something else. Coyote may come by. Who knows? And I had taken my arrow off, and I believe I had put it on for a little bit because I thought a coyote was coming in, if my memory serves. But anyway, I had not put another arrow back on the bow. So the bow's sitting there empty. And I lock on that buck, and I'm a spot picker. And when I say I pick a spot, I mean I pick a spot. I try to narrow it down to a hair. I'm one of those guys who believes in aim small, miss small. And I got so focused on him, and he come in gave me that perfect quartering away at about 15 yards, and I get the bow and I draw and fire without an arrow. And I'm standing there with a riser and strings. Of course, the deer is, he's out of here. That's a memorable failure, very memorable failure. That was a end of a bow, and I don't know what lesson you would take away from that. Don't get so focused. Actually, the lesson I took away from that is as soon as you replace your arrow, make sure you put another one on it. And I got a bunch of stories like that because I have done some. I fell out of a tree one time because I got so focused on a deer, and it was actually a doe, and she come in and she was blowing at me, and there's few things that bring me more joy than putting an arrow in a doe blowing at me. When they start all that foolishness, it makes me want to put them in the freezer. And she got out there and got to blowing at me, and I snort wheezed and I stomped. And I was up on a platform, and somehow my foot hit the edge, and I didn't have a safety belt. This is a long time ago. I was a kid. I hit that, and when I did, it just enough that something twisted, and I just basically bailed out of the tree. I was only about 8 foot high, and I was probably 21, so I was pretty tough at that point. And so I've done a lot of dumb stuff. I nearly ripped my ear off one time with a bowstring because I had to shoot from a weird position. I had a buck.
That's just not something you normally hear. I almost ripped my ear off.
Well, I had traded for a bow. It was a Power Mag. Some people may remember the old compounds. It was a Power Mag. And I had traded for it, and it was like 90 pounds. It was just ridiculous. And it was too long for me, and which is saying something because I got a long draw. And a deer come in down here, and I wound up like this trying to shoot. And when I released, it come by and caught my ear, side of my cheek, face. Of course, I didn't come within 100 yards of the deer with the arrow. And, but that was just stupid, and because that got me in a lot of trouble. I can lay on my belly with my long bow. Well, I say that I could a few years ago. I can lay flat on my belly, and I can kill a deer laying on my belly with my longbow. I can shoot from some of the most terrible positions, and my wife timed me one time. I can go from brace height to having that arrow on its way in about 1 second. I told y'all one time that in my opinion, the way I hunt, traditional archery is actually more effective. Form and everything with a compound, and form is important with traditional, but like I said, I've killed deer laying on my belly. I can shoot effectively laying on my belly, or I could a few years ago, since I went through some shoulder issues and back issues. I'm not sure I could still do that, but I can still shoot from very compromised positions, and out to 20, 25 yards, I'm pretty dangerous. With a compound, it's not like that. If you can't get, and actually our mutual friend that Brian, when you mentioned, that's one of the first things I told him when he started taking up traditional was he has such good form with a compound. I said, you can't use a traditional bow like that. You're going to get busted drawing every time. You don't have any let off. They're very different things. So, yeah, I've had some. If I sit here long enough, I can think of the ear. Had a cow chase me off one time when I was just about to get on a deer. I had a big old Jersey cow come out, and she was mad. And I'm not, I was raised around cattle, working cattle, and I was in a big cow pasture, and I was trying to slip up on a doe. I was in a ghillie suit, And I think that was the problem. The cow didn't know what I was. You know, a cow can be very aggressive toward a dog or a coyote. And I'm just about to draw on that doe, and I hear her coming. And I look around. I got a Jersey cow about 15 yards closing fast. And I forgot all about that doe. And I broke and run and got to a fence line. And you ever jumped a barbed wire fence in a ghillie suit?
I don't think I could jump it without the ghillie suit.
If you have a Jersey cow on you, you probably could. Because she didn't know what that thing was, but she was fixing to put a horn in it. And that's a much better memory than if I'd have killed a doe. But only because I got away from the cow. She was mad. I had the guy that tried to mess up my hunt that run the deer right over me, and I killed him. That was actually a success story. I was on public land, and there was because I was at a position that I just rode my four-wheeler from the house. It's probably 2 miles around the house. Got on my four-wheeler, I rode around there, and heard the guy pull up in the truck, and he just walked right to me. I had a tree stand at the time, and just very rude, just a jackass. And he went on down he said, "Well, you ain't gonna," because he had put a stand in there. I didn't know it, it's public land. I didn't know he had put a stand down there, and he told me, in no uncertain terms that, and this is back when I was gun hunting, and he told me that he was, that basically he was going to go mess up, and he did. He went walking down a ridge, come back around on the back side of the clear cut, and just run a pretty nice 10-point right over me. And I killed him. He was mad. That's just, I got a lot of hunting stories. We're not even getting into pigs.
Yeah, no, you got some crazy pig stories. That's what you mentioned Hooligan earlier. That's one of your catch dogs, or now retired catch dogs, when y'all are pig hunting. And I know you've told some stories. Actually, you were on our buddy's podcast, Nick Adair. Probably, God, that might have been 2 years ago, or at least a year ago.
Yeah, it had to be 2 years ago.
And you told some stories on there about getting caught with some pigs and having knife pit, just, a lot of craziness. But Travis, at a point of wrapping up, to, I guess, recap some of the woodsmanship conversation we've had, for anybody new out there, just realizing there's a lot of people that they might have hunted for 40 years listening or watching this podcast, or someone that's their very first season. For someone who's trying to become better at woodsmanship skills and want to not only have success, hopefully trying to kill some deer, but have more confidence when they're in their field getting around, what would you recommend for these individuals going out there and us to try to help build woodsmanship skills? What is something they should focus on this season and for seasons to come?
Honestly, Jacob, I think one of the best things a man could do to develop woodsmanship is to go buy you a .22 rifle, put a scope on it, and learn to love squirrel hunting, and learn to slip through the woods and kill squirrels. Small game hunting, anything that keeps you in the woods. I don't know of the other two guys I mentioned that I would consider excellent woodsmen. My Uncle Red, I don't know that he couldn't have run. I don't know that he couldn't have slipped up and knocked a squirrel in the head. A lot of your really good woodsmen cut their teeth on small game. I know I did, because I was squirrel hunting is still one of my favorite endeavors. I don't get to do it as much as I used to. But do something to get in the woods. I learned a lot. I went through a phase where I targeted coyotes with archery. And I learned a lot there. You know, I learned a lot about wind with coyotes, because you talk about something that is, when you start we've talked about this off air, you know, the coyote, when you just catch him running through the woods, he's actually almost careless, I would say. When you call him, he's a different animal. And if he can get around you and get your wind, he's probably going to do it. So I learned a lot with small animals. And you just got to love being in the woods, and you got to spend if you're somebody and you're working all year and you get 2 weeks to hunt if you're lucky. And because let's be honest, it's bow season now. I'm right here. I could grab that Black Widow recurve right there, grab those, and I could be hunting in 5 minutes. Most people aren't like that. Most people have to schedule a hunt. They have limited time. And that makes trophy hunting especially extremely difficult. You know, unless you're going to an outfitter where they're doing some of it for you and something like that, my advice to someone like that would be take your time and don't focus too much on trophy hunting. You know, I would be more interested in just trying to get a deer at that point. Because I can't, if I had to come to where you live and I had 3 days to kill a mature buck, I would bet on the deer. I would bet on the deer. You know, a lot of the guys that y'all interview, and your guys that are known for killing big deer, you talk about a trait in common: having a lot of time in the woods. Having a lot of time in the woods. You know, I kept a journal one year of my actual time, not preparing to hunt, of actual bow in hand in the woods pursuing game. And it was an enormous amount of time. Ask my wife. She used to say that I was pretty much a wild animal during hunting season. And I never got tired of it. The only time I ever got tired of hunting is when I got to running the cameras and targeting a single deer. I run into several times that became something that I didn't like what was happening. And that's one of the reasons I quit doing that. But my advice to them was, if you have plenty of time to hunt, get out there and hunt at every opportunity. If you're somebody that has 3-4 days, it's tough. It's tough. You need to have a friend or a good piece of property. If I only had 2 or 3 days to hunt, honestly, I'd hunt food sources. Because that's the most forgiving, easiest way to hunt. If you got 2 or 3 days to hunt and you go to wherever you're going to go and isolate a bedding area and kill a mature buck in that bed, yeah, you're playing a very low odds game there. So your strategy has to be crafted around the time that if you have limited time, I think food sources are hard to beat. Maybe transitions. It depends on where you're at in your woodsmanship too. You know, if you've been listening to podcasts and you have some knowledge, but you don't have much time in the field, you know, you might try something more advanced. If you're very inexperienced, I'd try to find a buddy that was more experienced to learn from, a mentor. A mentor can be my Uncle Red had a lot to do. I don't know that I learned a lot from my Uncle Red. Being around a woodsman can help you become a woodsman. And as I grew up, me and Uncle Red became close. And he noticed that, because what happened with that group was my other uncles, and the ones that used to rib me the most, by the time I was in my mid-20s, they were calling me. They'd say, "Travis, can you maybe, where should I put this stand? You know, I went from being ridiculed to being the expert. And a lot of that was because of Uncle Red. So find a mentor. Don't set expectations too high, and have fun. Because if you're getting to hunt, you're already ahead of the game.
Perfect. Travis, listen, greatly appreciate you spending some time with us today and let us come back here and do another episode with you, especially in person. All the viewers out there, if you've enjoyed watching this video, please share this on some social media platform, text it to a buddy. And also all the audio listeners, appreciate y'all listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed it, go leave us a 5-star written review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And again, Travis, thank you again for joining us. Again, thank you for letting us come to your house and film this podcast. And guys, we'll have to catch you back here on another episode from the Southern Outdoorsman podcast. Remember, y'all stay Southern.